Okay. Okay. Are we ready to go? Okay. So thank you for coming to the third and final local history talk hosted by Brook Museum. And today our speaker is Dr. Katherine Byrne, and she has a PhD in medieval and early modern studies from the University of Kent, and her specialism was popular politics, memory and identity in later medieval and early modern Kent. And today she's talking about rebellion in medieval and early modern Kent, which is very exciting. Before she starts, I just want to note that Katherine actually has a hearing impairment, and her hearing aid has run out of battery. So basically, instead of doing a Q&A session at the end, if you would like to ask her any questions, just come up to her after the talk and ask her anything. Yes. Okay. So I will hand over to Katherine, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, so this is on rebellion in medieval and early modern Kent, and what I really want to focus on, obviously we'll go through some of the rebellions that did happen in Kent, but what I think is really, really interesting is the nature of identity within that. So the identity of Kent and how that kind of was built through rebellion, and then how that almost created rebellion on its own type thing. So it became part of the reason for Kent rebelling in the first place. Now, we all have multiple identities at any one given time. So you might identify as your local community. You might then also identify as someone from Kent. You might also identify as someone from England, from Europe, your gender, your occupation. And everyone at any given point has multiple identities that they have all at one point. And the identity that leads you to act in a certain way depends very much on the circumstances that you're in at the time. So if you are from Brook, for example, and then you go to Canterbury, you're going to say, if someone talks to you, well, I'm from Brook. If you go to somewhere in London or York, you're going to say, oh, I'm from Kent. And if you go to Europe, you're going to say, oh, I'm from England. So the circumstances you're in very much shape the actions that you take. Kent as a county has its own many, many identities. So I'm sure you'll recognise this. This is the coat of arms of Kent. And you will see there's all sorts of stuff in here that shapes the history. It represents the history of Kent, the nature of it. So obviously Kent was unique in England. It was the gateway to the country. So if you were in Europe or Calais, you would go through Kent to get to London, which meant that the people of Kent were far more politically aware than a lot of other people in the country. It ran through Canterbury. You have the cathedral. So it was the religious centre of the country. This had a lot of impact on a variety of different things. You had the Cinque Ports. You have the history, the military history of Kent. Kent was involved in pretty much all of the European conflicts. And it was different from a lot of other counties in that you didn't have an overarching landlord like a duke, like you might have for the Duchy of Lancaster or someone like that. Kent was full of very small kind of officers of the monarch. Okay, so this led to a very different political kind of situation. Here you have a crown at the top here. That signifies the Cinque Ports, for example. There's the sails up the top, which again indicate the relationship between Kent and the Navy, as an example. You've got the White Horse of Kent, which indicates it's an old symbol for the Saxon Kingdom of Kent. You can't see it too much here, but that's the shield of Canterbury, the Archdiocese of Canterbury, and that one is the one for the Cinque Ports. You've got the lions here, well, sea lions. So we've got the Lion of England, and then you also have obviously the fact that it is a a sea lion. So again, we're talking about Kent's relationship to the Cinque Ports, to the sea, naval history, military history. And this is all tied up in this. We also have, I don't know if you can see here at the bottom, Kent's motto of Invicta. Now, I don't know, some of you may already be aware of this, but Invicta means unconquered. And you will see it everywhere in Kent. This is the tyre place. Oh, no. Apologies. This is the tyre place around the corner from my house. These are various different businesses, teams, everything like that. They are all called Invicta. You may not have noticed, but if you go around Kent now, you'll suddenly see Invicta everywhere. And this is one of the prime identities of Kent. It goes through history. It goes right back to William the Conqueror. Okay, and here we have can't see it very well, but this is a piece of writing written by someone called William Lambard in the 1570s. Okay, and he did a perambulation of Kent. So he essentially walked around all the different communities, collecting their histories, looking at documents and writing it out for everyone. He was one of the first, how we sort of understand historians today, an antiquarian. And he basically talks to the town of Swanscombe. And they basically talk about how William the Conqueror, they had been anticipating William the Conqueror coming through into Kent, and the commons of Kent gathered together and they held boughs, so branches covered in leaves, up in front of them. So it looked like they were a walking forest coming towards him. And they basically said, once they were close enough, and he marvelled, it says here, you can't see it properly because of the quality, but he marvelled that this forest was moving towards him. And then they took their leaves away and they said, right, we will either accept you and you will give us our rights, we will maintain our rights, or we will fight you and you will go to war. And he basically said, right, well, this isn't worth the fight. You know, there could be loads of them. I can't see. There's just this walking forest. So he gave in. And so Kent was the only county in the country to not be conquered by William the Conqueror. Okay, so they kept the custom of gavelkind, which was a partible system of inheritance. So whereas everyone else in England had primogeniture, so something was inherited by the oldest son, in Kent it split up between the children equally, which is why when you go around Kent, you'll notice a lot of fields and a lot of small holdings tend to be quite small in comparison, and that's because land was divided up until they had to basically petition to be allowed to move to primogeniture, because otherwise you had no land left. But the reason you had that was because, as legend says, they stood up to William the Conqueror and refused to be conquered. Gavelkind actually by law wasn't got rid of until around, I think it was 1923, I think. By that point, obviously everyone had not wanted to keep it, so they'd signed off on that part. But by law, Kent still maintained gavelkind up until the 1990s. And here in Swanscombe, you can see they have a monument that is dedicated to this story. Now, whether it is true or not is another question, but it is important because this has carried on through the history of Kent. It was important enough that people in Swanscombe in the 1570s could tell Lambard about this, and Lambard could write it in his stories. And that shapes how the Kentish saw themselves. It, I feel, helped them think about how they would act in certain situations. And when they were put in certain situations, that identity of Invicta kind of rose and made them feel in a way that perhaps on the daily basis, they're not going to think about Invicta or anything like that. But when the taxes rise, when perhaps their customs are under attack, that might be the point where they think, hang on a minute, we didn't settle for this before. Why would we settle for this now? Now, Kent has been involved in a lot of rebellious activity. It's been said that there was one Kentish insurrection, at least, in every generation from the last quarter of the 14th century until the mid 16th century. So every single generation experienced some form of rebellion in Kent. And this is important because actions shape identity and then identity shapes action. So the more people participated in rebellions, the more this created an identity of Kent being rebellious, which then led them to act in certain ways later on, if you see what I mean. So the first one that Kent was really involved in was the Peasants' Revolt. What I'm going to do is I've pulled out a couple of the big rebellions, and I've pulled out some of the main information from each one. And you will notice that a lot of that information is exactly the same. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the Peasants' Revolt rose in response to the third poll tax of 1380. It was in response to ongoing military defeat and political corruption. Now, I've put political corruption in quote marks because essentially this happens in every rebellion, and it's mainly because if you're criticising the king, you can't do that. That's treason. So what they used to do was say, oh, but he's surrounded by corrupt officials. And it's them. They're the ones that are stopping him. They're the ones that are leading him to do these things. And he's not aware of the problems that it's led to because they're stopping him from hearing it. And the point of rebellions, although a lot of us think that rebellions are to do with replacing leadership, often popular rebellions weren't. They were about reaching the monarch, to be heard, to make him aware that there are these issues. And that is usually why you will see something to do with political corruption. There will always be someone blamed for what is being done under the king's name. So there were risings in Kent and Essex in June, and they met in Dartford. The rebels then took Rochester Castle, they occupied Canterbury, they made the aldermen swear an oath of loyalty to the king and the true commons, and marched on London from Blackheath. Blackheath used to be in Kent and is now part of Greater London. They used a lot of language like common profit, okay? And common profit is the old version of commonwealth, and it basically means everyone is working for the good of the common profit, the commonwealth. And this is one of the first areas that we start seeing this phrase. Okay, so Commonwealth comes directly from popular rebellion. Okay, so they march on London, they meet with King Richard at Greenwich, but nothing is resolved. The rebels get to Southwark by the 13th of June and are joined by London rebels. They open the Marshalsea, Lambeth Palace and the Savoy, and they surround the Tower of London. In June, they then meet with the king at Mile End. They send out charters in response for a lot of demands. Most of the rebels then disperse. The Kentish remain, and they invade the Tower of London and they kill the Lord Chancellor and the Lord High Treasurer because they hold them responsible. They are the corrupt officials, and they want to see action taken. The next day, they make further demands of the king. Wat Tyler is killed, and the London resistance collapses after that. There are revolts in St Albans and Suffolk. Cambridgeshire was put down by the king and the council by the end of July. There are indictments, there are executions. Norfolk and Essex are brutally suppressed, and then pardons are eventually given out by Parliament. But in Kent, what they do is they hit very specific places. They go through Pennenden Heath, which is Maidstone. They go through Canterbury, they go through Rochester and Blackheath onto London. Okay, and these sites often have significant meaning. They've got often used as a place of justice. And what the rebels do is they co-opt systems that already existed and use them to their own benefit. Because keep in mind, they are not rebels in the sense that they are going against the law. They are working within the law and they are trying to reach the monarch. So they use these areas, they use this language to justify, to show that they are on the side of the king. They are fighting for truth. They are fighting for what is right. Now, they used a lot of the concept of Kent as well. So when they were at Dartford, they made a rule. They said no one who lived at any place within 12 leagues of the sea should come with them, but they should keep the seacoasts free from enemies. Okay, so this is another part of Kent's identity with the sea being invaded a lot. They still have a duty. They still have the purpose of Kent is to defend the coast. And to fight off any invaders. And they make sure that they maintain that even when they're marching on London. Okay, so this is the decisions they make very much are shaped by where they are from and what their duties are. Now, following on from this, we then have the Loddard Rising of 1414, Cade's Rebellion of 1450, Fauconberg's Rebellion, 1471, the Kentish Rising in 1483. They participate a little bit in the Cornish Rebellion of 1497. They resist the amicable Brant in the years 1525 to 1528. They rebel in 1549 and again in 1554. So this is the start of a long history of Kent getting involved in rebellions and fighting for what they consider to be the truth. So the next big rebellion is Cade's Rebellion. And you will see that we see the same places being used, the same language being used. It's developed a little bit further now. Instead of common prophet, it's common weal. Motivations here are the loss of French territory. So because Henry VI signs away Maine and Normandy, they're really not happy. And they blame the death of the Duke of Suffolk. Okay, so this is the corruption that is existing at this point, and the Duke of Suffolk is held accountable. He is executed on a ship when he's exiled on the way to Calais. They host a kind of mock trial, chop off his head, and his body washes up on Dover Sands. So one of the other reasons that they're terrified and that they rise in rebellion is because a rumour goes around saying that the king is going to turn Kent into a massive hunting park in revenge for the death of Suffolk. So they get very scared. They start sharing out pamphlets. They share out the language of common weal. Again, the duty of the people of Kent to defend the commons, to defend the truth, to contact the king and make him see that things aren't right. They also blame taxation. But this seems to be one of the common things that they always say that they aren't happy with. And then actually, when you look into it, at this point, taxes were probably the lowest they'd ever been, and lowest they would be for a while. So it's something just to keep in mind when we're looking at why people say they're doing this. Often they're buying in to a rhetoric. They're buying in to, well, we're not happy. What could be the reason? Taxation's always the reason. Yes, we're angry about taxes. It's not always necessarily the case. But yes, they're very angry about the loss of Normandy and Maine, and they're angry about this kind of rumour that's going around. So again, they collect at Pennenden Heath at Canterbury, they march on to Blackheath, and then they march on to London. They enter on the 3rd of July, and on the whole, the Londoners are actually quite sympathetic to their cause. And then once they're established in London, Cade demands and finds Lord Say and Seal and his son-in-law, William Cromer, and they hold a sham trial, and they execute them as traitors to the King and the Commonwealth. Say and Seal and Cromer are both very unpopular people in Kent at this time, and they kind of were hiding, and he finds them, and then they are no more. Unfortunately, then this turns into looting and violence, which turns the Londoners against them, and they are expelled from London, and Cade flees. On the 20th of July, Cade is fatally injured by Alexander Iden, who's the future Sheriff of Kent. And that is sort of the end of Cade's rebellion. But what we get during Cade's rebellion is a lot of popular poetry. Okay, so a lot of poetry to do with popular politics, and there is a lot of poetry talking about the commons and their fight for the truth and their fight for honour, and their fight against traitors. And this is one that comes up, this is in the 1460s, so this is all part of the Wars of the Roses, which is obviously a very, very turbulent time. And what you get with the weakness of the people up at the top, so Henry VI and Edward of York and everyone like that, is that because that is so unstable, the actions of the commons actually rises into a much higher prominence than it would have ever done before. And so it is in the political elite's benefit to get the commons on side, which is not something they've ever had to think about doing before. But it is needed now. So we have a lot of this kind of poetry. Now, this is probably done to support Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, in the Wars of the Roses. And he's clearly courting the Kentish. He's off in Calais. He's been exiled to Calais. And you get a lot of You get a lot of poetry like this, where they talk about, the true commons of Kent, coming with you, falsehood to destroy. They lapped away the fat from me. That is Henry VI, basically saying, everyone took advantage of me. They stole, they embezzled all my money. They got rid of all my property, my land, Maine, Normandy, all those kind of things. These corrupt politicians, these evil people who are working against the common will. And the commons of Kent are the ones that are going to bring it back. So you get a lot of this kind of poetry going on at this time, and you can see an identity being created. You can see people playing into it, and it works because the Kentish rise up again and again and again. So they clearly see something in that perception of Kent, and it is successful. You also get an example of the Cornish Rebellion in 1497. Now, this is done in Cornwall, as you might expect, in response to the taxation against the war in Scotland. So this is under Henry VII. And he's raising taxes because he's worried about the threat of Scotland. The Cornish don't think this is relevant to them. They don't even think really that they're English. And they really resent being asked to pay for anything to do with this. So they rise and they march across England to Blackheath, and they call on the Kentish to help them. They call on this what was termed kind of Kentish fire. Unfortunately, this is one of the times Kent didn't really help. And there might be reasons for this. Again, it might be to do with identity. As a coastal town often being invaded, they might have actually seen the threat that was coming from Perkin Warbeck in Scotland and thought, actually, no, in this situation, we align with the king more. We see the need for this taxation. We don't know properly, but for whatever the reason was, for the most part, they don't join the rebels of Cornwall at Blackheath. And that completely undermines morale, and the rebellion all kind of washes away. They were easily defeated by the king's forces, and this resulted in massive fines across the board, which is what Henry VII liked to do. So you can see how not only is there a narrative that is being created around Kent and around its fire and its determination to fight for the truth, but other people are aware of it as well. And that caused the people from Cornwall to march all the way to Blackheath on the hope that, the Kentish are always up for a rebellion. We can count on them, they'll help. And in this case, they didn't, and it completely undermined the entire thing. So we can see this narrative and this identity starting to develop and starting to shape people's actions. So then we have the rebellions of 1549. I've kind of put the Duke of Somerset and everyone else. It's a slight exaggeration, but we do have risings going up across about 25 different counties. The rebellions of 1549 are massive, but generally when we hear about them, we just think about the Western Rebellion and Kett's Rebellion. So the Western Rebellion is the southwest, and they are rebelling because Edward VI is pushing forward a very, very, very Protestant religion, and they tend to be Catholic. in the southeast, they are rebelling because of socioeconomic issues. So they're rebelling against things like enclosure and different issues to do with farming and bits and pieces like that. They tend to be Protestant, so they don't have the same religious issues. In Ket's rebellion, you have, like I said, enclosure is an issue. They pulled down a load of hedges all around the fields in Norfolk, which had recently been enclosed. So enclosure is when maybe a landlord decides to put up fences around what has previously been common land that everyone used. They might graze their animals on it, or they might use it for a bit of farming. And a big landlord might come along and just fence off some of it for his own use. And this was really, really upsetting to a lot of people. A lot of people depended on that common land in order to subsist. And so when that got removed, that was really, really significant. So in Ket's rebellion in Norfolk, the rebels gather on Mousehold Heath, which is basically the equivalent of sort of Pennenden Heath and stuff for Kent. And they all gather under the Tree of Commonwealth. I'm going to go forward a bit because I've got an image. You can't really see it there, but that is the Tree of Commonwealth here. And that is the King's man visiting, and that is someone being very, very rude and showing his bum to the King's man. I'm not sure if you can see that properly, but there you go, some little cheeks. So this man is, the king is coming to treat with the rebels. You know, they've set up an entire justice system, again, on Mousehold Heath. And the king comes to, well, not the king himself, obviously, comes to talk to them and to try and work out what's going on and how they can deal with it. And he's seen off quite rudely. So yeah, in Ket's situation then, they set up their own structures of government and justice. Within a few days, they numbered around 16,000 people, so Ket's rebellion was quite big. They were led by tradesmen and yeomen. In July, the rebels took Norwich, despite offers of pardons. And we ended up with full-scale rebellion, full-on fighting. Around 3,000 rebels were killed in the end by the Earl of Warwick, and Ket was hanged in Norwich in December. That's one of the big famous ones, probably understandably. There was a lot of death. It was a very, very bloody rebellion. But across the southeast, we have other situations as well. So they rise in Kent, in Essex, in Sussex, in Suffolk, and pretty much every other county. And they rebel under the title of the Rebellion of Commonwealth. So now we're not just fighting for the Commonwealth. We're not just using language of commonweal and common profit. They are naming themselves Commonwealth men. So again, they are adopting this now. That identity has become even stronger. They're using it to justify their actions in a way that they are embodying this idea of Commonwealth now within themselves. So you see a lot of reference to these men called Commonwealths and Latimer, Commonwealth of Kent, that kind of thing. So they are now really using it. Now, I've put a load of question marks for the motivations here because although enclosure was a really, really big thing for a lot of the southeast, we've already talked about Kent's unique inheritance system. By this point, a lot of Kent had been enclosed for ages. Okay, so enclosure, usually they are rebelling against new enclosures. And we do get some of that in Kent, you know, like someone, there's a place called Boxley Heath, I think. And we have reports of local people, where enclosure had happened with consent, no one pulled down those fences when 1549 came around. But there had been one particularly obnoxious landlord who had put up some fences without consent. And when 1549 came around, they ripped all those fences down. So we do have some of it happening in Kent. But for the most part, Kent has already been enclosed for years. So there's not really a reason for them to rise in 1549. For the most part, again, they support the religion of the king. So, and in fact, they use that to get concessions out of the Duke of Somerset. They're like, oh, we're not like those people in the southwest. You know, we support you. This means you should support us. So they use the joint rebellion in that way. Joint religion. And again, the taxes aren't that high. They are higher, but they're not high enough on their own to justify why Kent rises at this time. We don't really have any surviving evidence. We know they did write a list of demands and they gathered with Essex and everyone like that. But we can't really find a reason for the Kentish people to rebel. The fact that they called themselves Commonwealth men means that there may well be a very significant part of them rose because they felt they had to, as Kentish men, as people who rebel for truth, rebel for the Commonwealth. You know, they are calling themselves Commonwealth men. They're going around stating this and getting people worked up. So it could well be that, obviously not the only reason, but a fundamental reason for joining in with these actions could well be that this is what they do, this is who they are. By this point, you've had, I mean, I've just done a few rebellions, but we've seen many, 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 many rebellions by this point. Again, they gather at Canterbury, they gather at Pennington Heath, they gather at Blackheath. The same places again and again, the same language again and again. In Kent, so just as Kent's men marched on Norwich, the Kent rebels marched on Canterbury, Maidstone, the Suffolk men on Ipswich and Bury St Edmunds, the Oxfordshire men on Oxford. So what we see kind of across the country at this point is people rising to make a point, it almost seems like. They don't really march on London this time. But there is definitely a political point that they are making. And the fact that they use the word Commonwealth as a name suggests that that is their point, almost. Somerset first offers pardons and payments to persuade them to stand down. Some dispersed while others were forcibly put down. And commotions continued in Kent, Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, and Northamptonshire up until 1551. So it doesn't really ease up. They're constantly just creating problems. So up until this point, we've seen kind of the development of an identity of Kent as rebellious. As Kent, not rebellious in a traitorous way, but in a fight against traitors to the Commonwealth, to the country, to the monarch. But we don't have any real rebellions in the 1590s. There is one in 1596, the Oxfordshire Rebellion, which essentially is 4 men and a dog on a hill, and they all get brutally killed in a massive overreaction. But we don't really have a real rebellion in the 1590s. And by all intents and purposes, we should have had one. There were successive harvest failures, there was food shortages, there was high food prices, taxation was really, really, really high. There were succession concerns. So by this point, obviously, Elizabeth clearly is not going to have an heir of her own body. She's not named an heir. And no one knows what's going to happen. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. There's threats of invasion. We had the Armada of 1588, but there continued to be worries about, people kept saying, oh, they're going to send another one, they're going to send another one. And the country was on high alert for most of the 1590s, expecting another Armada. So people are really, 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 the 1590s is incredibly tense. And we know that people aren't happy. So the Kent Quarter Sessions records identify riots and riotous behaviour in Herne in 1591, in Lenham in 1593, Pembury, Old Romney and Midley in 1594, Herne Hill and Canterbury in 1595, Chiddingstone in 1596, Ham in 1597, Hawkhurst and Dartford in 1598, Swanley, Aylesford, Hucking, Boxley, Sundridge, Charing and Sevenoaks in 1599, and Ash in 1600. So clearly in the 1590s, Kent is very unhappy, and they're rioting all over the place throughout that decade. And yet we don't have the same kind of action that we've seen so many times before that Kent is so known for. Part of this is considered is one of those things that historians really debate about, you know, the decline of popular rebellion. And there is a certain number of reasons that we do see. So there's the argument that the movement of the middling sorts, so what we would consider the middle classes, move away from the lower sorts, so they're kind of co-opted into the systems of government of the monarchs, which kind of removes the natural leaders that would have previously arranged and organised these rebellions. Also, we get a lot more homilies, sermons, and rhetoric of obedience, promoting the idea that rebellion is against the Commonwealth. So what they've done is they've co-opted that name Commonwealth that they had used so often and made it work for order and obedience within Elizabethan England. And we also see the lower sorts being excluded from political dialogue and involvement over the 16th century. So where we see the height of the involvement of the lower sorts in the Wars of the Roses, when the systems are so turbulent that actually we can really see what the people want. We see them rise in a way that you don't really see at any other point in history. The clampdown after that by the Tudors, where they kind of really push down, you start seeing the word Commonwealth starts meaning two different things, and they start pushing down on any kind of thought that the lower sorts might even have a right to speak. Whereas before, if you're part of the Commonwealth, you have a right to say something. The Tudors put forward the argument that no, in order to support the Commonwealth, you stay in your place and you do not speak. So that is the message that they put through. And that is also counted as one of the reasons we start seeing this decline in popular rebellion. But again, I think there is also an element of identity here. And we can sort of see it in two small examples. So one is Canterbury in 1595. So we have this riot sort of riot that crops up. Leader is Ralph Leonard. And obviously this is around harvest failures and people in Kent, what they're seeing is all the corn that they grow and harvest being taken away from them and taken to London. And they really hate that. They really, really are upset about that. And you see a lot of discontent across the board. And in Canterbury, what they do is they consult a guy called, what's his name? Roger Fennells. Okay, so he is kind of up the social scale, and they basically say, we need to put a stop to this. Can you help us? What can you do? And he says, I can't do anything personally. And they're like, but could the poor people? And he's like, yeah, you could, but you have to be careful. And they have these set of rules. So they stand and prevent the wagons from leaving Canterbury, but they make sure that they do not touch the corn and they do not take any weapons, and they agree to go when they're asked to go. So what the poor people of Canterbury are doing is they're trying to express their discontent, and they do raise a fuss, but they do it in a way that they think is legal and lawful. And they've done it by consulting someone who they consider to be an expert in these matters, to tell them exactly what they can and can't do, and they try to stick to those rules. So these are some of the documents from that. Conveniently, the two most useful bits are this bit and that bit, which are completely faded away. But you can see their accounts there. So they're saying, you know, he went to Roger Fennells standing at his door and asked if he could stay the corn, which went out of town in wagons. And he said he could not. And then Mrs. Abner asked, what if the poor men should stay it? he said they might if they would, but he would give them no counsel to do so, but told them they might stay it, but not touch the corn. So you can see, and they repeat this again and again. So they really, really make a point of that they consulted someone, they asked for advice. He said, this is what you must do and you will be okay. This is then investigated, because obviously this does count as a riot. And while they find this one, they come across another one that is being arranged in Herne Hill. Now, this is about 6 miles away from the Canterbury one. It's for the same reason. Okay, they again are really upset. They're really suffering actually in Herne Hill. They're slightly more rural. They're really being impacted by the 1590s and what's going on. And this is led by a guy called Nicholas Bratt and his brother-in-law, William Adams. And I couldn't get images of this one because it's on microfilm, so I've just written it out for you. But yeah, so about a group of about 30 men from Herne Hill and Harbledown had originally intended to rise for corn. So it says they proposed to pull the farmers out of their houses by the ears. And they were going to take a bullock. They were going to fetch a fat bullock out of the marshes and to bring him there and eat him amongst the poor men, and so to go from thence and further doing, and further saith that John Drinker, William Ellis, William his son, heard Adam speak the words to Bratt. So this is a very, very, very different type of situation. It's the same reason, it's practically the same place, at exactly the same time. They find this because it's happening at the same time that they're investigating this other one. But this is far more traditional. They refer to Bratt as their captain. They talk about Bratt's camp. They talk about Bratt's company and that they are Bratt's soldiers. Pull the farmers out by their ears. This is much more violent, and this is much more kind of traditional in our understanding of what a rebellion is. It doesn't get started. They find it in time and nothing really happens. But the use of the language and the way they went about it, considering this is exactly the same time and in pretty much the same place for exactly the same reasons, you can see how... Why didn't they group together? Why didn't they talk? They could have talked. They were literally a walking distance from each other. What is going on? And a big part of it, as we say, is all those reasons before, but also the legal ways that were taken by the Canterbury rioters had to be also influenced by their location. They've got much more, they've got people that they can ask for advice. They're more aware of perhaps legal organisation within a city than Herne Hill does in their rural situation, where they are far more desperate because they've been far more impacted by these issues. And so they're not thinking about Kent. They're not thinking about Kent's identity as rebels. They're thinking about their own very small localities. Certainly the Herne Hill lot are thinking about the history and how you go about it, but they're not thinking on a broad scale. And we can see how perhaps challenges to Kent's identity have led them to perhaps, and the removal of the people that would have organised it before, might lead them to go about it in a different way and prevent them from mobilising on a grander scale. And we have things like this. So this is Shakespeare's Henry VI Part 2. And this comes out in the 1590s. So it's about Cade's rebellion, but the issues he addresses are the issues that are going on in the 1590s. So he's talking to the people of the 1590s in a story about the 1450s. And what he's doing is mocking the idea of Invicta. So this is Cade. This is when Cade is killed by Iden. And he just goes on and on and on about how I wouldn't have been killed if I hadn't been starving. I am yet unconquered. It's famine that got me, not Iden. And he goes on about it, like he goes, oh, I'm slain, famine and no other hath slain me. And what we have here is, tell Kent from me, she has lost her best man. I that never feared any, and vanquished by famine, not by valour. And Cade throughout this is made out to be a bit of a fool, a bit of a clown. And here he's clinging to that invicta. The what he has done in rebellion is being mocked and made to look foolish. And we can see this in a variety of different things that are put out around this time, that sort of takes that identity that the Kentish people were so proud of and turns it on its head, makes it a mockery. And while this on its own probably isn't enough to make any massive change, alongside all the other elements, like the shifting of the middling sorts and the real use of things like homily of obedience, everything like that, we can see why perhaps in the 1590s we don't have the rebellion that really there should have been. So yes, I think thing to take away from this is we can look at all these rebellions throughout Kent and we can look at Kent's identity and we can see all of these things. And I think we need to consider how identity and identity on different levels can lead us to do things, and really affected Kent's history. And I mean, Kent rose in rebellion many, many, many times after as well. But if I was going through everything, we'd be here forever. So thank you very much.